Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Greetings, listeners. As you know, last episode I returned to the topic of the 180-degree rule. And so this episode, I am resuming my conversation about the responses to the 180-degree rule episode. So this is 180-degree rule part 2. User JD Top pointed out one that's an interesting bit of counterintuition, which is games that tell you can cheat. Now, I only know of 2, although I'm sure there are more. JD Top points out Cheating Moth, which is a game where you're supposed to cheat by secretly discarding cards, and as if people don't catch you doing it, then you succeed and you get to keep going. Now, I don't know, I haven't played that. I saw the Shut Up and Sit Down review a while back, but I don't know whether you have to do that or whether you just can. But the one I'm reminded of is there is a cheat card in Cosmic Encounter that allows you to take extra cards or do other things to cheat. And as long as you don't get caught, you are allowed to do that whenever you like. Now, this is interesting because it is counterintuitive in that most games don't even say you can't cheat. It is an unwritten rule. And in some ways that makes it a really strong element of the 180-degree rule, in that a game says you can't cheat. And when I play games, I do not spend a lot of time watching for people cheating, because if I played with somebody who was going to cheat, I would not play with them again. Or I'd have to have a very long talk with them first about what that does. That cheating is appalling. It is a breaking of the basic social contract of the game. And in some ways, maybe the cheating rule, the rule that allows you to cheat in some games, is actually a very good representation of the 180-degree rule, because it is unwritten and unacknowledged by most people. Most players are not aware of the way that the 180-degree rule works. It just does. It provides them the ability to understand what's happening in the narrative without them realizing it. And so perhaps the no cheating rule is the closest I've talked about today in terms of the 180-degree rule, because it is so ubiquitous and so instinctive that of course you can't cheat, and cheating is specifically known to be wrong. And so a game that lets you cheat is obnoxious or is counterintuitive. The really interesting thing here is a game that has a cheating card, where you know the cheating card exists, is very different than a game that has a cheating card and you don't know that it exists. I'm reminded a little bit also of Blood Rage. In Blood Rage, there are cards that allow you to invoke the god Loki, who gains in the game by losing battles, which the rest of the game you're trying to win the battles. This was also brought up by another user whose name I did not write down. I apologize. But this certainly is that same idea, that the Loki cards are essentially cheating cards. And early on in the game, people talked about the Loki strategy being unreasonably strong. And I think, in my experience, the Loki strategy is sort of like the science cards in Seven Wonders, in that if you let somebody take a lot of them, they are unreasonably strong, but thus one of the basic gameplay mechanisms is you can't let someone take a lot of them. That they are too powerful if accumulated in strong numbers, and thus that's something you have to watch out for when you play the game. But if it's the first time you're playing, you maybe don't know that. And I think early plays of Blood Rage for a lot of people were disrupted by people using the Loki strategy, and then other people complaining, well, that's too strong, you're cheating, it feels like you're cheating. And maybe it feels cheap because it overturns the goal of the game, which is to win the battles. And then Loki doesn't want to win the battles. It feels disruptive. In some ways, that harks back to one of the great rules of card games, which is shooting the moon. You know, if you've ever played Hearts, one of the things you can do in Hearts is try to get all of the hearts. There are 13 hearts plus the Queen of Spades. If you manage to take all of those, then you've shot the moon, and instead of losing points, which you do the rest of the game, everyone else loses points or gains points. It's a golf-style game. You're trying to not have points. But in Hearts, if you shoot the moon, if you take all the points, you don't actually take them. Everyone else takes them. So that part is really interesting as an example of that kind of rule that's really old, as the Loki rule, or cards that let you cheat. Cards that let you cheat are interesting too because they play on the meta game, right? If you have the Cosmic Encounter cheat card, the way you do that is by actually doing things that you're not supposed to do in the game. Whereas in the Loki one, you overturn what happens when you play within the rules of the game. The cheat cards allow you to play outside the rules of the normal rules of the game and win by doing so. Someone else pointed out that the game Flux is basically just this. The game Flux is the constant addition of new rules or changing of new rules. But as such, I think Flux actually doesn't fit this paradigm we're talking about the 180-degree rule, because Flux is specifically about breaking that rule. And in some ways, games that are very simple that focus on one of these rules maybe shouldn't be involved. Like Hanabi is the example I brought up in the original episode as a game that breaks your instinct about cards because it has you hold your cards backwards. But in some ways, Hanabi's kind of like an experimental art film in that it is just about holding your cards backwards. There's no violation of your instinct directly because you aren't doing other things also. Perhaps a game where you hold your cards backwards in the middle of doing all this other stuff that you normally do would maybe be more akin to breaking the 180-degree rule in a big production movie because it is so out of place, whereas a game about breaking that rule. And someone in the thread did make the point that board games are kind of about breaking these rules in the way that most cinema is not. And I would suggest most board games are not either. We're focusing on the idea of these rules being broken, but I think most board games are about maintaining the kinds of rule sets and adding a little tweak to them, adding a bit of spice, not presenting you with a confounding mental space. All right, what other examples do we have? Serious ? Lee also pointed out two others that I did not mention. Of course, Rob Davio with Risk Legacy and the other Legacy games that have followed broke the inherent 180-degree rule that the components in the game are sacrosanct. And this maybe is another really good example in that, like, my children still get a thrill out of tearing up a card. And we've played a bunch of Legacy games. My daughter actually doesn't like to do it because one time she was tearing a card and just as she tore it, one of my friends said, "No, not that one." And she jumped and then felt really upset that she had torn a card she wasn't supposed to. And then we and she was like 13, 14 at the time. So it's not like, wasn't doing this to a little kid, but still she was shocked by that and now doesn't like to tear up cards when it's her turn to do so. Has one of us do it instead. But putting stickers on the board, writing on the board, this is a thing that gets to the core of what you're supposed to do with games, especially expensive hobby games, where a big part of it is maintaining their quality. To then be instructed to destroy part of it is really interesting. Gloomhaven is a great example of this. Gloomhaven is a Legacy game. You're supposed to put stickers on the board. You're supposed to write on things. You're supposed to tear up cards. But the popularity of the reusable stickers and the number of people who save have little bags with the cards that they didn't rip up set aside, presumably so they can play Gloomhaven again after they play the 100 missions, is really interesting to me, rather than the thrill of the permanent decision, which is what I like about it. Serious ? Lee also suggests that the discard pile in Magic was a fundamental change, and I think there's something to be said for that, although discard piles have been something that have been used in card games before. Jin, of course, has you taking cards off the discard pile. I think of the innovative things Magic did, I'm not sure the discard pile is one of those things that broke people's brains. Probably the idea of bringing your own deck of cards would have been the big change there over previous games. And then Pedro Artur pointed out that the resources don't belong to me argument that someone else made, and the argument I made in the original episode, which was that dice are to be rolled. Pedro Artur pointed out there are some games where the dice that you roll don't belong to you. He points out Lorenzo Il Magnifico and one other one. The one that stood out to me is Castle Dice. Castle Dice is particularly interesting to me because at the beginning of each round, you get to select a certain number of dice that you would like to have rolled. And then those dice are added to the communal pool, and everyone else also adds dice to the communal pool. then you roll those dice in the communal pool, and then you draft those dice. So you could have a situation where I'm the only one who takes a yellow die. No one else chooses to take one. I take a yellow die, we roll it comes up with the best side. I think it's the 2 gold or whatever. And then someone else who gets a draft first takes the yellow die. Well, what a ripoff. I'm the one who used one of my picks to put the yellow die in there, and then you take it? Lame. Actually, not lame. That's one of the cool things about that game. But it is sort of counterintuitive that I picked a thing and it doesn't belong to me. And I think that does go to that core idea of that there are things in the game that I own and things in the game that you own that we don't both own. Well, I'm keen to hear, having heard this continuation of the conversation about the 180-degree rule in games, what other things have we missed? The conversation continues over on Boardgame Geek. I will post a link to these episodes in that forum, as well as a short text summary of them, and we'll see if it continues. I think this is a useful way to think about elements of design when you're discussing what people think. As a closing, I'll bring up, there was a side conversation there that referred back to Carpe Diem. As you all know, Carpe Diem First Edition has this rule, this sort of 7-point star in the middle of the board, and on your turn you move your pawn along one of the lines on the star to one of the other points where you could go, and then you stop there and take a tile. And then on your next turn you move along the points of the star, either back where you came from in the first round or forward to the next one. Now, once one of the depots where you could stop is empty, you get a third choice. You could either continue moving in the direction you started going, or you could turn around and go back to where you came from. And this presents you with more options as the round extends, and I think is excellent. It's also fun to bounce your character around the star tactily. But there are a lot of people who figured out mathematically there's no difference between a star and a circle. If you just move side to side, it's equivalent to the star. And easier to understand. Apparently some people had difficulty envisioning how the star worked and finding where they could go and not go. So in the second edition and later, they changed the rule to include the circle instead of the star. But I'm firmly in Rado's camp here, where I say that the problem is not that they get rid of the star, although I think the star is a crucial part of it. The problem is that they got rid of that third choice, because they made a rule that once you start going around the circle, you keep going till you get to a spot where you can get. In part because traveling around a circle feels like forward motion, whereas when the motion that you're doing to travel to the next depot involves stopping and going in a different direction, it feels like a bounce. And once you're bouncing, it feels like, why can't I bounce back to where I came from? There's an intuition there in how the rules should work that changes once they have the circle. I bet once they had the circle, people found it hard to remember that they could go back. So that's where I'm settling in thinking about this 180-degree rule, is to remember that the whole point of the 180-degree rule is that it is difficult, that it has created an intuitive way for people to understand how they interact with the board game, or that intuitive way. It has created an intuitive way for people to understand how the visual language of television or cinema works. So in board games, there are a number of similar conventions that, while it can be useful to break them, it's really important that designers think carefully about when they do and have a good reason for doing so. With a game like Hanabi, where you're actively choosing, okay, this is the rule I'm breaking, it's sort of like an art film or even just a narrative film that has one gimmick. The gimmick is clear up front and people are aware of it, it works fine. But when you casually break a rule that people expect to work in a certain way, people have intuition about, and you do things differently without really having a good reason for doing so, then you end up with people being confused about how the game works and unclear about how to proceed. Such is the case when you break one of the board game 180-degree rules. Well, hopefully this continuation of the conversation was interesting and helpful to you. I would love to hear your thoughts on the additional ideas at play in the conversation, and know what you're thinking about, what additional rules we've missed, what elements of the design space could use additional thought regarding the 180-degree rule and where we should proceed. You can join the conversation over on Boardgame Geek, either in the forums for Pick Up and Deliver or in the general forum. Just search for the Board Game 180-degree rule. Probably on Google we'll find it faster than the Boardgame Geek search. And that would allow you to more easily find that particular conversation as it occurs. You can also find a direct link from the website at rattleboxgames.com, where I post show notes that include things like links to forums on Boardgame Geek. Well, I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.